Today's roadshow seeks to provide the business community, including SMEs, women, youth, with important information on the IATF, its relevance to Africa's transformation in integration ambition. Ladies and gentlemen, you may also recall that in 2013, African heads of states and government adopted Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, as a blueprint for transforming the continent into an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, driven by its own citizens, representing a dynamic force in the international arena. The establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area, aimed at stimulating intra-Africa trade and advance economic integration, is amongst the first flagship projects under Agenda 2063. This historical agreement establishing the FCT was signed in 2018, came into force in 2019, and trading under this protocol started in 2021. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for Africa to take her destiny into her own hands and determine her own development agenda. However, to do so will not be easy and requires commitment, courage, and deliberate action from all of us. Traders need to seek out new market opportunities on the continent rather than the current conventional route of turning to markets abroad. Our political leadership need to open their markets and ensure that the AfCFTA is given full legal and operational effect in their countries. Our financial institutions will need to hold and support intra-Africa trade and investment in spite of the perceived risks. We at Afreximbank are proud to be contributing to this positive history of African economic integration and development. Afreximbank is at the forefront of supporting the FCTA and has developed several financing and facilitation instruments to support intra-Africa trade. You will hear more about this morning. Between 2017 and 2021, Afreximbank disbursed $20 billion in support of intra-Africa trade. And we plan to double this to $40 billion by 2026.
From the outset, let me thank Afreximbank for inviting me to this roadshow that marks an important milestone towards actualizing Inter-African Trade Fair 2023. We also thank the Kenya Export Promotion and Branding Agency and other stakeholders for bringing together the business community to participate in this roadshow. Seeing you all in this room this morning is a clear demonstration of your continued commitment and thirst to participate in international markets, and we commend you for that. This roadshow is extremely important. We believe that it not only represents a chance to engage the business community out there, but it will also deepen our understanding of how to conclude transactions, how to do the business-to-business activities, to create that initial interaction that enables you to actually take those into contract stage. That's the most important thing. We want to see deals signed as a basis of this trade fair. And as His Excellency, the Vice President has said of Afreximbank, a number of deals were already done in your prior edition, and we look forward to this number going up. And let me turn my attention to intra-African trade. This in Africa is less than 15% of Africa's total trade in comparison to much higher numbers in other continents. But the good news is that this trade is on the rise, and the AfCFTA is playing a key role in modernizing, industrializing, and being an influential player in as far as advancing African trade.
Mr. Jaswina, as the chair of KEPSA and KEPROBA, you have a full spectrum of the private sector space in Kenya. How are you ensuring that Kenyan companies learn and seize opportunities created by the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. And I think it's very apt for this audience. The truth of the matter is, yes, there's a huge opportunity out there. We're looking at 1.4 billion people on the continent. The combined market size for the continent is $3.5 trillion. Kenya is 100 billion out of that. So you can do the maths. It's a very small pie, a very small slice of the pie. And yes, to grow our economies and to make sure that we start thinking differently, we need to start thinking market diversification, product diversification, regional integration. There's so much that needs to be done. And especially when you look at the stats, they're totally discouraging because Africans don't trade with Africans. 14.4% is the trade number, Africa trading with Africa. So Africa largely trades with outside Africa. And I don't blame Africa in its entirety because obviously you see the situation, our infrastructure doesn't support intra-Africa trade. I think it was mentioned earlier on. But largely, if you go back into our history, rewind yourself 50 years, 60 years, I think our colonial past, the infrastructure that was built on the continent was more extractive. What can we take out of the continent to Europe or our colonial past? And so that is largely raw materials. So when you see the infrastructure, whether it's copper in Zambia, you know, the railway line is built to take goods out from the mines. If you look at cotton in Mali or Burkina or Uganda, so our entire infrastructure is extractive base, gold, South Africa, or diamonds, it's all extractive. It's in to out and not in to in and out to in. So we have a serious problem with infrastructure. I know in my own business, I was trying to buy some fair trade cotton from Mali, and the delivery time was 5 months. Why? It had to go to Singapore before it comes to Mombasa. And so it just doesn't make sense in terms of logistics. The world is moving. Everybody wants speed to market. And speed to market can only be driven if we have connectivity on the continent. If you look at the air option is also extremely expensive because of the various taxes that are involved in the various countries. And we are looking at, 55 countries. Short of saying that the African Union, it's a huge opportunity for the continent. But if you have to go to Casablanca, I have to go to Europe and then come down. And how does that make sense? Why should I go to Europe? And I really didn't want to go to Europe, but I need to go to Casablanca. So I think we have issues around infrastructure, but the opportunity is huge. The opportunity is now. And for Kenya, 60% of our exports are in the region, and we want to grow that. Our exports today are about a $6 billion export. Our imports last year actually went up to $21 billion. Our trade imbalance moved up from $10 billion to $15 billion. We've seen the pressure on the shilling because of that expansion. But if you look at the import book, that $15 billion, the $21 billion import book, a lot was not from Africa. Like I said, very little was from Africa. So we, as a continent, and if I look within the continent, the largest trading partners on the continent, really China and India, and I call them Chindia. And Chindia controls 40% of the import book on the continent. So we can't replace that. It is possible, and we will. And I'm sure combined in this room, we can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that passionate contribution. And you've really reinforced the infrastructure gap that we still have on the continent when it comes to trading with one another. And I would like to go to Mr. Shah. You're in the automotive industry. Are non-trade barriers an impediment to intra-African trade? And what are some of your ideas of the best way to address them to widen the market and create the opportunities?
So when we went to the last IATF, we found that each and every country was actually coming up with their own automotive policies and regulations and standards. And the last IATF is when the whole automotive sector actually got together for the first time. And we started building joint synergies on what affects in terms of non-tariff barriers or how do we improve trade within Africa. Africa imports about more than 3 million vehicles a year. And I would say probably 90% of the vehicles are second-hand, and they actually come outside Africa. There's a lot of trade from, well, a lot of imports from outside Africa. We find that biggest barrier is the second-hand vehicles coming in. There was a research which was done which has figures on 70% of the African countries actually import vehicles which are more than 15 to 17-year-old. And those vehicles actually come in from Far East, India, okay? And none of those second-hand vehicles actually come in within Africa. So why can we not have new vehicles made in Africa, and we trade with second-hand vehicles within Africa at a substantial incentives and all that, and what AFCFTA is working on. The other issue was on standards, and I think we're now working on the ASO standards for the automotive sector, and looking at how do we create similar standards within the African continent. And instead of each and every country working on their own standards, we looking at have a standard for Africa and see what we can do together. The other issue was on, there is no need of each and every country coming up with their own model and manufacturing their own model. We rather work together and look at how we can have one model and sell to the whole of Africa. And the standard, basically a model which is created for Africa. And instead of each and every country making their own models and not getting volumes. In automotive, I think the biggest competitive edge is when you have volumes and we have more than 3 million vehicles demand, I'm sure we can be able to get volumes within Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You've talked about the standards and also for us to create our own automotives and then trade with the continent. So how have you been able to harness the power of innovation, technology in that aspect?
Okay, so we've come up with an association which is African Association of Automotive Manufacturers. And South Africa being number one leading in automotive, followed by Morocco. We actually placed Kenya as number 5 or 6. So a lot of discussions and joint programs have come up in the last 2 years, where we've had, in the last 2 years, we've had more than 40 South African companies coming into Kenya and partnering with the parts manufacturers, with some of the assemblers in creating new vehicles. We have a lot of discussions on the e-mobility sector in the last 6 months, especially when our president is quite committed on looking at e-mobility. On development of parts for the Euro 4, Euro 5, and Euro 6 vehicles, there's a lot of discussions going on. How do we have people like VW, Mercedes coming in and developing the whole automotive sector? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll come to you, Ms. Flora. You've been in the manufacturing industry for a very long time. You're a leader in your space, but you're also very passionate about building the next leaders in the manufacturing industry. You've invested a lot in youth and women. So how should the young entrepreneurs position their businesses and brands for regional integration?
There's a lot of opportunities for the women and for the youth. And I believe one of the things is they first of all have to come to the party. So how prepared are they to come to the party? And there's always, yes, let's export into the African continental. It's a great opportunity. But what is the stability of your business? I always believe in going deep before you go wide. So I believe this is their time to really solidify their businesses, make sure they have proper business models. And there are a lot of associations and groups that can actually help women and youth solidify their businesses, have a strong business plan. And once you have that, then you start taking such opportunities, because, I mean, they're brilliant markets. I think the doctor who was here earlier said that there's this whole supply chain, I would call it a push, because if I supply a big brand that actually is going onto the continent, they will build my capacity and they would help me to go there. So for me, it's around having an open mind, looking at opportunities, making sure that you're a solid business and that you come to the party. Because what I tend to find with a lot of the youth and whatever, there's this whole notion of like, there's no chance for us, we don't have the funding, but there's a lot of hand-holding, there's a lot of opportunities, like I mentioned, either through supply chain associations, groups, that could actually do that. And we saw Afrexim Bank is already one of them. So there's a lot available, and I think they do need to take the opportunity.
I mean, you're in the industry of new money, as some call it. So how do you think we should position the creative industry at the Intra-African Trade Fair 2023 to ensure that the creatives maximize on the opportunity? And what are some of the opportunities that you see for the Kenyan fashion industry by engaging at the IATF?
Thank you very much for the question. Firstly, I would like to say that the creative industry is an industry that hasn't been looked into deeply. And I'm glad that Afrexim Bank has really looked into it, and just hearing from the story of Under a Tree to where we are right now. I was able to attend the last one online, and also was present at the Trade Roadshow the last one as well. What I would like to say is that we need to look at the creative space not just as fashion, but as different aspects of the creative space. We have film, we have culinary arts, we have sports, we have music, we have dance. It's so wide, and we are yet to find an institution or organization that can dig deep and really demystify the different sectors of fashion or art and really be clear. And I want to believe that by the funding with Afrexim Bank, we are able to now categorize these particular sectors, because each sector is quite huge and has its own participants and its own, it's a whole value chain. Music is a value chain. Fashion is a value chain. Culinary art is a value chain. And if I take an example of fashion, where I'm at, is where I look at farm to fashion. It's not just the clothes that I make. It's from the farmer, the woman in the village. It's from the youths who are down there. And some of the things that we need to look into, if you go to Cote d'Ivoire or most of the African countries that really look into the cotton value chain, you realize it's the older people who are actually the farmers and in the fields doing fashion. So how are we able to really have this conversation that we are able to have, even the younger generation getting into farming, from farm to fashion, so that I can be able to wear an outfit that I can trace, because also traceability is quite important right now for us to trace where is the product coming from. We can trace this is from Maina in a certain village, and we are able to trace that from the thread of the cotton and all that. And just sitting here on this panel, I'm glad that I'm also with my mentor on the panel. And I get fabrics from Jazz, his factory in Nakuru. And we can be able to trace from the cotton and then the way the spinning is done to the fabric to the end. So how do we translate that to even the younger people? Because Africa is not just the next big thing, but it is the big thing. If we look at whether it's architecture or any aspect of creativity in the world right now, is all the inspiration is from Africa. But the saddest part is that we as Africans have not really stepped up and positioned ourselves and taken up this space and say, we own it. Let's be the ones to speak about it. Let's be the ones to position this. So I think for me is it's to see how we are able to also work on the whole sector and maybe be very sector specific and see what are we building from the whole value chain of each and every creative sector. If I take an example of the fashion industry, Africa is a space where we do not have our own measurements. We still use either American measurement, European measurements, and it's something we forget. I mean, we don't even think about it. And it's time for the bank to invest if there's money. I mean, we have designers and creatives across Africa who can be put in a room and can actually start working on this. And we can create the first African sizing, because we are very different. My upper part and my lower part is quite different. I'm a size 14, size 16, and we're just blessed that way. So if we can just appreciate, we need to appreciate ourselves and be proud of ourselves. So this is a challenge that I'm throwing to the bank. With the money that you've set aside, we have amazing creatives across Africa that we can bring into a room and start this process. What do we need to do? Who are the organizations that we need to work with so that we can finally come up with a measurement for Africans by Africans?
To you, Mr. Kudakwashi. You've heard from the other leaders their thoughts on what needs to be done to expand the intra-African trade and where the key challenges are. You've been in this role since, you've been in the role of the Regional Chief Operating Officer, East Africa for Afreximbank since 2015. You've understood the market. You've worked with the leaders on the market in Kenya and across East Africa. Should Kenyan companies look to trade in Africa beyond the East African region? And what does that actually even look like?
Thank you very much. And I think the answer to the question is yes. And we need Kenya to look beyond the East Africa community. Because when you look at Kenya's exports as a percentage of GDP, have not been doing particularly well over the last few years. I think we were 24% in 2011, and I need correction to these numbers, and just I know you are good at the numbers. We are currently 20.7. So we are yet to go back to where we were some years back. And it cannot be done through over-reliance on an East Africa community export arrangement. We have to look beyond the East Africa community. Kenya is already doing quite a lot in the East Africa community. It's a leader in terms of trade. And when we look at the fact that we are probably trading the most in terms of our linkages into the African continent beyond tea, we are a hub for petroleum products, crude oil products, etc. But they are going just into the region. And yet we are struggling to up our export numbers. It tells you that we have to look beyond what we are doing in the East African community. If we go into the rest of the African continent, the benefits to that is that it brings us diversity in terms of what we export. It brings us resilience because we get to produce goods that are better in terms of standards, because going out of East Africa, Flora raised a thing. When she wanted to trade with Ghana, a lot of questions were asked, and she demonstrated that she could. And when you break into the markets outside your own region, you bring that resilience because your goods are likely to be accepted beyond your traditional market. So it is important because you start creating opportunities for value-added goods. Because if you want to trade in tea, I live in Uganda, coffee. We have tea, we have coffee. What can you trade as Kenya if you are in the tea and coffee sector? So you need to move out to the bigger markets, Nigeria, increase your share in Egypt, etc., because that's how you can bring value-added goods. We also need to increase our exports beyond the East Africa community because you need to generate enough income to offset the import bill. It keeps rising. And currently, when all our imports are denominated largely in US dollars, the pinch is felt. It's bigger, and we need to increase the volume of our exports. And you cannot say, if you're a Kenyan company, you reach point of saturation for East African community, and the market has been widened by the coming in of the Intra-Africa Trade Fair. And we actually would like to engage with Kenyan exporters who want to sell beyond East African community, because in every country you go to, you will find an Afreximbank trade finance intermediary. And by that we just mean it's a complicated way of saying commercial banks that we have a relationship with. So you then say, I want to trade with Ghana, but I'm not quite sensing the commercial banking terrain. Afreximbank, can you add an instrument to make it more favorable for me to receive payments from these parties? We've been talking of the rollout of the Pan-African payment system. Those are some of the ways in which we will come in to assist with making you become more comfortable to export. Now, international standards. If you are a serious exporter and you're exporting only in your neighboring countries, the truth will catch up with you, because whatever certification you got from KEBS may not be sufficient. How do you develop that? You start to need to venture into unknown territory so that you can grow bigger. So you go, probably I'll take the phrase that I got, you went deep, you now understand your markets, but to go wider, you need to build that infrastructure around you to make your goods accepted. And you could actually spend quite a lot of time thinking you're doing well until you move out of the comfort zone. Human capital and skills cannot be grown when you're just looking into one market. To develop the skills, to develop the expertise, go wider, and there is space for Kenyan enterprises to do that. And that's how also we get our MSMEs to be involved in what we do, because it creates a wider base for everyone to participate. So there is all the right reasons for Kenyan enterprises to look beyond the East African community. And the FCFTA, the FCFTA provides such an opportunity for them to grow the African market wider and become more relevant. Probably those are the points that I could give for giving reason why Kenyan enterprises need to look beyond the East African community.